The Second World War was the single greatest conflict in human history. 80 to 100 million soldiers and civilians died in it. We'll never know for sure how many, and it touched every continent on the globe. British Prime Minister Sir Winston Churchill said in 1940, "This is no war of chieftains or princes, of dynasties or national ambition. It is a war of peoples and of causes. There are vast numbers, not only in this island, but in every land, who will render faithful service in this war, but whose names will never be known, whose deeds will never be recorded. This is a war of the unknown heroes." So it is left to the historian to retell their stories over and over again until the unknown becomes known, until the reasons are all understood, until all the victims are counted and named, until all the heroes are honored and the monsters unmasked so that they be seen for the monsters that they are. This is both a daunting and a monumental task. The Second World War was happening everywhere, to everyone, and at every moment, combatants and non-combatants alike. For the United States, the Second World War began at about 7:48 a.m. on December 7, 1941, when 6 carriers of the Japanese First Air Fleet, the WWII, from a location about 250 miles north of the island of Oahu, launched 360 aircraft in 2 waves and struck the U.S. Pacific Fleet in a surprise attack on the naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Their primary target that Sunday morning was the 8 battleships on Battleship Row, moored around Ford Island. At the time, it was generally viewed by most countries that the power and prestige of any nation's navy was in their battleships. The big gun club ruled the waves. When the attack was over, it would not be the battleships, but the aircraft carriers, who had been at sea at the time, and the submarines, who would carry the fight to the enemy. Prior to this, aircraft carriers and submarines, they played a secondary role to the big guns. The submarine's job had been regulated to that of coastal defense, or as scouts ahead of the fleet, to report the enemy's location, its course and speed, and to do what damage they could while the big guns of the battle fleet were brought to bear. Pearl Harbor changed that forever. After the raid, the 8 battleships of the U.S. Pacific Fleet were either destroyed, burning, sunk, or buried in the mud at their moorings. There were 4 U.S. submarines in Pearl Harbor that day that helped fight off the attack: the Narwhal, Dolphin, Shallot, and Tautog. Submarines were never expected to engage enemy aircraft. They were far too vulnerable for that. Even the smallest piercing of the pressure hull could have a devastating effect. The submarine's best defense against enemy aircraft was to dive. Dive quickly, dive deep, and escape if possible. On December 7, 1941, this was not an option. From the minute the first bomb dropped, the submarines tied to their moorings opened up on the enemy aircraft, just like the rest of the ships at Pearl, with every available weapon they had. Post-war analysis indicates that of the 29 Japanese planes lost that day, at least 2 were damaged by gunfire from submarines, and 1 probably shot down before it could launch its torpedo against Battleship Row. The U.S. had been slower than most other countries in submarine development. The first U.S. submarine, the USS Holland, was commissioned in October of 1900 under the command of Harry H. Caldwell. The Holland was some 53 feet long. It had a gasoline-powered engine for running on the surface and a 66-cell battery that drove an electric motor that turned the propellers while it was submerged. The Holland-class submarine, because of its small stature, slow speed of barely 6 knots, and short range of 200 miles, had led submarines to be called boats instead of ships, a badge of distinction submariners still wear proudly today. The Holland had 1 forward torpedo tube and carried 3 torpedoes, including the one preloaded. Mounted forward of the sail, it had an 8.5-inch gun for surface action. Submarines were basically viewed as a gunboat that could submerge for short periods of time. The low power and volatility of the gasoline engines of the day made them less than ideal means for surface propulsion. The fuel tanks often leaked both in and outside the boat, intoxicating the crew, and there was always a risk of fire. As submarines developed, the first U.S. submarine to employ diesel-electric power was the USS E-1, hull number SS-24. Unofficially, she was named the Skipjack. Early in submarine development, the U.S. Navy had ceased giving submarine names, instead opting for a class designation like the E-class and a hull number, SS-24, meaning she was a submersible ship, SS, and the 24th produced. The E-1 was launched on May 27, 1911, and commissioned on February 14, 1912. Her first captain would, 35 years later, lead the U.S. Pacific Fleet to victory in Tokyo Bay, then Commander Chester W. Nimitz. Nimitz would play a leading role in submarine development and to their incorporation in fleet operations. In 1916, during the First World War, the E-1 became the first U.S. submarine to cross the Atlantic. Gone were the days of short-range coastal defense. The U.S. submarines were coming of age. Often referred to as pig boats, there is some dispute as to where this term originated. As small vessels, unlike most other ships, submarine lacked certain amenities, like the ability for the crew to take a shower or wash their clothes. This hardly seemed important, as the first boats were small and short range. They were made for coastal defense, and the crews would likely not be out more than a week at a time. As the boats grew in size, capability, and longer times at sea, a larger crew was needed as well. The men shared bunks, a term known as hot bunking, though this was not as common in the U.S. Navy as it was in some of the others, and they bathed as best they could, kind of bird bath style, out of a bucket or a basin. Needless to say, a boat returning after a few weeks at sea, and the men possessed a certain ripeness. Another popular theory comes from the shape of the submarine itself. Narrow in the front with bulbous ballast tanks along the side, and with forward dive planes rigged out, the submarine did somewhat resemble a certain bovine. Whatever the reason, it did not deter the men from wanting to be a submariner. A submarine was a posting desirable for officers too. It potentially afforded a young officer the opportunity for a command of their own much more quickly than might otherwise be possible in the surface fleet. Between the launch of the E-1 in 1909 and the introduction of the first fleet boats 30 years later, 21 different classes of submarine totaling about 190 boats were built for the U.S. Navy. Some experimental boats were only produced in small numbers of 1s and 2s, while others, like the S-class that was produced from 1920 to 1925, over 50 were built in 4 different groups. Each group of S-class boats included some different design variations, with some being a single-hull design, meaning that the ballast tanks that, when flooded, enabling the submarine to dive, were located inside the pressure hull, while others were a double hull, with the same tanks wrapped around the outside of the pressure hull. When taking into consideration the 2 subs of the same class, each hull design had distinct advantages and disadvantages. The single-hull designs were sleeker, allowing for greater surface speed and faster dives due to less hydrodynamic resistance, but it sacrificed interior space of the submarine. The double-hull designs, with the tanks on the outside, well, they were larger, making them slower on the surface and in diving, but it did free up valuable interior space. U.S. submarines continued to evolve, drawing from a variety of design and developments, including those of other countries. With the success of the German U-boats during the First World War, the U.S. Navy saw the potential for long-range submarine operations. To meet the needs of the fleet, the new submarines would have to be approximately 300 feet in length, displacing about 1,500 tons, and have a top speed of around 20 knots surfaced, and a range of 10,000 nautical miles, plus a test depth of about 250 feet. They must also carry provisions for up to 75 days at sea. This was a tall order. The first of these new boats, the USS Tamber, SS-198, was commissioned in 1940. Tamber would prove to be the perfect learning platform for what was to come. The Tamber class, USS Gungeon, made the first U.S. war patrol of World War II. Gungeon departed Pearl Harbor on December 11, 1941, and became the first U.S. submarine to patrol off the Japanese home waters near the island of Kyushu. On January 27, 1942, just west of Midway, Gungeon added another first, sinking the Japanese submarine I-73 and becoming the first U.S. submarine to sink an enemy warship. 12 Tamber-class submarines were built between 1939 and 1941. All of the fleet boats that would later serve in World War II were built on the basic design of the USS Tamber. In 1940, based on what had been learned with the Tamber, the U.S. Navy began construction of the Gato-class submarine. The Gatos retained much of Tamber-class's overall design. The hull was strengthened, increasing the test depth from 250 to 300 feet, and the Tamber had a single engine room for its 4 diesel engines. This design proved to make the submarine somewhat vulnerable to depth charge attack. The new Gatos would have 2 engine rooms, each containing 2 either General Motors or Fairbanks Morse diesel engines, though some of the early Gatos had the unreliable Huvens-Owens-Rentschler engines. These would be later replaced during refit. These new fleet boats had 10 21-inch torpedo tubes, 6 forward in the bow and 4 aft in the back, and they carried 24 torpedoes, 16 forward and 8 aft. For surface gun action, they carried a variety of deck guns, which could be mounted either in front of or behind the sail. These were typically a 4-inch 102mm 50 caliber Mark IX gun or a 5-inch 127mm 25 caliber Mark 17 gun. These were single-purpose guns, unlike the guns on some capital ships like, say, a destroyer, which could be used for both surface targets and anti-aircraft. A submarine's deck guns could only be used on surface targets. The deck guns were meant for smaller vessels that didn't warrant one of the sub's limited supply of and expensive torpedoes, or to finish off a damaged vessel from the surface should the situation allow. A surface submarine during or after an attack was extremely vulnerable. Mounted fore and aft of the bridge was a pair of 20mm Oerlikon cannons. These would be replaced over time with 40mm Bofors. Bofors provided a bigger punch. And contrary to Hollywood and popular myth, submarines did not, well, at least were not supposed to use these as anti-aircraft guns. Submarines have no armor plating to help protect them from enemy aircraft's bullets and bombs. Hitting a fast-moving aircraft is extremely difficult, as the kamikazes later in the war would prove. A submarine's best defense against aircraft is to dive and hide. All of the US submarines of World War II were double-hull design. They had an outer hull or a superstructure that held the fuel and the ballast tanks and gave the submarine a ship-like hull that would allow it to more efficiently cut through the water. To dive, the crew from inside the pressure hull would open a set of vents at the top of the submarine's ballast tanks and a series of valves at the bottom. As water rushed in the valves at the bottom of the tanks, air would be forced out the vents in the top, causing the submarine to basically begin a controlled sinking. Now, submarines had 2 sets of dive planes to control the angle at which it dived. The bow planes at the front, which were folded up along the side of the submarine when surfaced, and 2 stern planes in the back behind the propellers. Think of these as small wings for the water. As the 2 propellers in the stern pushed the submarine forward, the dive planes could be tilted up or down to change the submarine's depth. The goal once submerged was to achieve neutral buoyancy, meaning there was enough water in the ballast tanks to make the submarine sink, and just enough air to make it want to float. So, as the 2 propellers in the stern drove the submarine forward while submerged, the dive planes could be tilted up or down as needed to change depth. Now, this is a gross oversimplification of everything that happens when a submarine dives or surfaces. I just want you to try to get the idea. Along the outside of the superstructure are a series of holes. These holes can vary depending on the manufacturer of the submarine itself. There were 3 basic places that manufactured submarines. What these holes do is they allow water to flow through the superstructure around the pressure hull when diving and push out any trapped air. Underneath the superstructure is the pressure hull. The pressure hull is what keeps the submarine from crushing like a tin can when submerged by the weight of the water above it. On top of the superstructure is the sail. The sail houses the bridge. The submarine is commanded from the bridge by an officer or the captain when surfaced. It also has the fore and aft gun decks where we saw the Oerlikons and the Bofors. At the top of the sail are 2 periscope wells, the SJ radar mast, the SD radar, and the communication antennas. Now, the SJ radar helps the submarine locate surface contacts beyond the horizon, while the SD is basically for detecting approaching aircraft. As you and I are standing here, the weight of the Earth's atmosphere pushing down on us in all directions is 14.7 pounds per square inch. We don't notice it because our bodies have evolved to compensate for this external pressure. If you've ever had your ears pop in an airplane, this is because the higher you go, the less atmospheric pressure. As a submarine dives, for every 33 feet of water is equivalent to 1 atmospheric pressure. This effect is cumulative. The weight of the water on the Gato-class submarine operating at step depth of 300 feet is about 133 pounds per square inch. The pressure hull is divided into 8 watertight compartments. From the front to the back, or bow to the stern, they are the forward torpedo room, the forward battery compartment, the forward control room, the after battery compartment, the forward engine room, the after engine room, the maneuvering room, and the after torpedo room. There's another smaller pressure hull at the top within the sail, and it's called the conning tower. The conning tower is 8 feet wide and 17 feet long. It is from the conning tower that the captain commands the submarine when submerged. Now, the conning tower holds the 2 periscopes, a large observation scope, a thinner or smaller diameter attack scope. There is also the torpedo data computer, the helm for steering the submarine, a sonar station for listening, and the SD and SJ radar stations. During an attack, the conning tower could have as many as 10 men in this confined space. The pressure hull on a Gato-class submarine is made of 7/16 thick mild steel, giving it a test depth of right about 300 feet. The later Vallejo class, which are nearly identical to the Gatos in every way, had a hull made of 7/8 inch high tensile steel, increasing its test depth to 400 feet. Though many could dive deeper than this, the test depth was how deep the submarine was rated to go and safely operate. Submarines were not direct drive, meaning the diesel engines didn't turn the propellers directly. Each diesel engine drove one of 4 high-speed electric generators and through a series of reduction gears. These, in turn, powered electric motors that turned the propellers. The electric motors also provided power for the boat. The diesel engines could be tasked independently of each other from the maneuvering room. While 1 or 2 might be charging the batteries, the other could be on propulsion. The more engines on propulsion, the faster the sub could go. When I spoke with Paul Ferrace, president of the USS Cod Association in Cleveland, Ohio, he told me that World War II submarines like the Cod also have an 8-cylinder auxiliary diesel engine in the bilges of the after engine room. This provides additional electric power, often used when the sub is at the pier and can't hook up to shore power, or maybe just needs a few extra knots of speed. When submerged and the diesel engines were shut down, the electric motors were powered by 2 banks of 126-cell batteries in the forward and after battery compartment. A typical battery charge, depending on how much they needed, took about 8 hours, but would last for 24 to 48 hours submerged at 2 knots. Only on very rare occasions would a submarine attempt this, as the crew was limited to the amount of breathable air by what was inside the submarine itself. Now, pre-war doctrine called for submarines to be submerged during the day on batteries and to surface only at night, run on diesel engines, and to recharge. This doctrine was thrown out the window during the war. Trying to track and approach a fast-moving convoy submerged at 2 knots in order to launch an attack is difficult at best, and unless that convoy's track took them right past the submarines, it was often impossible. One tactic developed during the war was the end around. On sighting a convoy submerged, one that the submarine could not get close enough to fire on, they would let the convoy pass, and once out of visual range, the submarine would surface and dash ahead at full speed using their diesel engines. As a general rule, most cargo vessels and stuff at the time only operated at about 10 to 12 knots, whereas a submarine could go up to 20 knots, and they kept track of it on the sub's SJ radar. Now, once ahead of the convoy's projected course, the submarine would pull the plug and submerge and make a slow approach to fire their torpedoes. In an emergency, a submarine on batteries could reach a speed of up to 9 knots submerged, but this made a lot of noise from the cavitation of the sub's propeller and would deplete the batteries very quickly. World War II for U.S. submarines began on the afternoon of December 7, 1941, when Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Ernest J. King ordered the Navy to execute unrestricted air and submarine warfare against Japan. Like Great Britain, Japan was an island nation, poor in natural resources, so the iron, the tin, the rubber, the bauxite for aluminum, and especially the oil, especially to support their war effort in China, had to be imported. Also food to feed their growing population. Before the war, Japan had the capacity to transport 6.5 million tons of cargo across their far-flung island empire. The Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee after the war found that U.S. submarines sank 201 naval vessels, including several aircraft carriers, for a total of 540,000 gross registered tons, and 1,113 merchant vessels for a total of 4.7 million tons. That's out of the 6.5 million tons they started with. Hollywood often shows the aircraft carriers as the dominant ships in the Pacific War, and in many ways they were. But in the number and tonnage of ships sunk, the US submarines outperformed them all. Carrier-based aircraft sank 520 ships for a total of 2.1 million gross registered tons, less than half of that of the tiny little US submarines. 263 submarines conducted 1,600 war patrols. 52 submarines and 3,505 men were lost and still on eternal patrol. The U.S. Submarine Service had the highest casualty percentage of any of the American forces in the war, running at about 20%. They also rescued more than 500 downed pilots, laid over 14,000 mines, and performed reconnaissance on Japanese-held islands prior to some of the numerous amphibious landings. All of this by a force made up less than 2% of the U.S. Navy. In the next episode, we're going to go over the weaponry, especially and dedicated directly to the torpedoes. Torpedoes are another interesting story of the U.S. submarine force in World War II. For Echoes in Time, I'm David Brown. Thanks for watching.